My name is Melissa Merritt. I'm an associate professor at the University of New South Wales, which is in Sydney, Australia. And this is just a short video about Immanuel Kant's conception of the sublime. And I think that when we approach this topic, it's important to think about, what does this word even mean? A lot of people in just normal usage will say something sublime when they kind of mean it's beautiful. And in the 18th century, when the notion of sublime really became a kind of a thing, which doesn't say the concept of the sublime didn't exist before then, but when it became sort of something that people were actively thinking about and sort of thematizing, a lot of what was going on was gradually being distinguished from the beautiful. So that's a big topic unto itself, and I'm not going to try to say too much about that here. But I just want to start with kind of asking this question, what does this word even mean? And I think it helps to kind of go back to, like, what is the word? Where does it come from? The English word sublime comes from the Latin sublimo, which is a verb meaning to raise or lift up, elevate. And just as in German, when Kant refers to das Erhabene, he's using a noun form from the verb erheben, which means raise or lift up. So something that's sublime is raised or lifted up, elevated. And you see this if you go back to the original Hellenistic era text that is in many ways taken to be the source of a lot of this. We don't know the exact author, but it's Longinus or Pseudo-Longinus, perihypsos, hypsos is, again, from hypsoo, which is to raise or lift up in Greek. So all these words come from this idea of raising or lifting up. So it's natural to ask, we should ask, what's being raised up, elevated, and what's it elevated above? So that's one kind of question that I want us to circle back to at the end of this video. Now, the second kind of preliminary has to do with where Kant, this is just really a video about Kant's conception of the sublime, but I'll have to say a bit more about context and other influences. Where does Kant talk about the sublime? Well, most people who are familiar with Kant will go, well, he talks about this in the third critique, the critique of the power of judgment, 1790 work, the last of his three critiques. And that's true. So the critique of power of judgment is divided into two parts, the critique of aesthetic judgment and the critique of teleological judgment. There are a lot of puzzles about how this work coheres as a single unified work, which, again, I can't really go into here. But the analytic of the sublime follows the analytic of the beautiful in the first half of this book, which is the critique of aesthetic judgment. And curiously, Kant makes quite clear that the analytic of the sublime he calls it a mere appendix to sort of his main task in the book. So he says that the analytic of the beautiful, his account of our appreciation of beauty, is actually the pivotal part of the book doing the part that does the main task of the book. And again, it's too much to go into exactly all it is, but it's just worth noting that he doesn't think of the sublime, the analytic of the sublime, as a terribly important part of that book. Now, so that means that, so that raises a question, like, well, why is he talking about the sublime there at all? And one reason you could say is just like, well, in the 18th century, when people were talking about aesthetics, this topic of sublime kept coming up, and so he kind of had to weigh in. It's more than that. So that's a sort of cynical answer, and I don't think that's quite the right answer. Like, the concept of the sublime is actually extremely important for him. But its roots for him, why it's significant for him, go back to his ethical writings chiefly. So I'll say a little bit about that too. Okay, so what actually you have when you look at his ethical writings, and this spans core critical period writings, like the groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals, which is 1785 work, the Critique of Practical Reason, which is the 1788 work, and then into later work like the Religion, 1793, Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Alone. Those are kind of the main places, and there's some discussion of our appreciation of the sublime in the 1797 Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View. So in all these works, we find remarks about sort of the sublimity of morality and of moral perfection or of virtue. So we find that spanning a long period. And then there's also this earlier pre-critical work called Observations on the Feelings of the Beautiful and the Sublime, 1763, I believe. And that is a sort of strange work. It's a kind of anthropological work, not very much concerned with the aesthetics of the sublime, actually a little bit with the morality conception of how these ideas are connected to morality. But in many ways, it's not, I don't find it a terribly satisfying work. So I'm not going to say very heaps about it. In fact, I'm not going to say anything more about it after this. Okay, so our sort of initial question is, we know that sublime means something's elevated or raised above something else. So we want to know what's being elevated and above what. And the second question is kind of, well, when we look in the ethical writings, he talks about the sublimity of morality, and we need to understand kind of what that means and where that idea comes from and what his sort of take on it is. But before we try to answer those questions, I just want to say a little bit about historical context. So I mentioned this Hellenistic Greek writing, perihypsus, usually translated on the sublime. That's kind of a work of poetics. It's like about how does a writer write in such a way as to sort of produce this elevated, heightened state of mind. But in the 18th century, a lot was written about the sublime, and a lot was written about the sublime by Anglophone writers. So I use that as an umbrella term because one of the key writers was Edmund Burke, who was Irish. So it wasn't just English writers. Anyway, there was just heaps. If you start digging, it just seems like every sort of self-respecting intellectual felt like they had to write some little essay on the sublime. Tons of stuff written on the sublime. And one of the things that's characteristic about 18th century British or Anglophone aesthetics is there's a bit, like, there's less of this stuff about like the beauty or sublimity of art and more about just sort of direct experiences of nature. So it's sort of less about this kind of poetics, how does an artist create this sort of experience in a viewer or reader, and more about just what these sort of immediate encounters with nature. That's a sort of a general point. It shouldn't be overstated because one of the writers about the sublime, one of the most important, Joseph Addison, wrote these essays on the sublime in this periodical called The Spectator in early 18th century, like 1723, around there. And he talks about the grandeur of nature and these experiences of the grandeur of nature. And this is kind of in many ways taken to be one of the inaugural texts on this kind of writing about the sublime. But he also wrote about the sublimity of Milton, actually using the word sublimity rather than grandeur. So it's not the case that they only wrote about sublimity in connection with nature. But at any rate, that was kind of the dominant theme. And the other thing that the British writers were doing, or the Anglophone writers were doing, was kind of gradually working towards an account of how the sublime is distinct from the beautiful. And we find that most sharply expressed in Edmund Burke's inquiry concerning the ideas of the beautiful and the sublime. Sorry, I'm doing this off the top of my head, so maybe I'm getting a few titles wrong. Anyway, and so Burke has this really sort of strict separation of beauty and sublimity, and basically for Burke, beauty taps into these kind of feelings, basically sexual feelings, male, heterosexual, sexual feelings, so that what's beautiful is small, smooth, and round. And sublimity taps into these feelings of self-preservation. So something that's sublime kind of threatens you feel like your life's at stake in some way, but you also recognize your safety, and so you can kind of savor this. It kind of allows you this opportunity to kind of feel this self-preserving drive. Okay, so Kant when he writes the third critique and divides it into an analytic of the beautiful and analytic of the sublime, he's obviously learned a lot from Burke, and he takes a fair amount from the Burkean psychology, but of course it's all entirely in his own context, and these things mean all sorts of different things for him. And certainly the feeling for the sublime is not to do with our physical self-preservation, although it does, for Kant, in some aspects involve this kind of sense of a threat on one's physical self-preservation, or one's more generally kind of sense of being at home in the world and able to orient yourself in the world. So I think you can say that generally for Kant's theory of the sublime in nature. But what this sort of threatening thing does to you is draw your attention to this sense in which you're not just a physical being, but you are a rational being, and you are a person, and that there's something that preserves personhood that's distinct from what preserves your thinghood or your animalhood. And so when we enjoy the sublimity of nature, what we're actually enjoying is, what that threat on our physical existence is doing is throwing our attention to our essentially rational nature and this idea of kind of what it is to preserve that, in effect. So, and that gives us this kind of strange pleasure. So one of the things about the feeling of the sublime is it's usually mixed. It has this kind of repulsive element because you're being threatened, and then also a positive element because you're kind of looking towards something that's inspiring, or that's orienting for you, or that's normative for you, and that you identify with. So there's heaps to say about that, and this is again a short video that's already gone longer than I expected it would. Anyway, so one of the things about, now I said at the beginning that, well, there's this, Kant has this treatment of the sublime in the third critique, but he also has all this stuff he talks about the sublime in his ethical writings. And one of the things about Kant talking about the sublime in the third critique is he's talking about the sublimity of nature, the ways in which nature presents itself. Sometimes we have these experiences of it's just being massive and crushing, absolute, just massive, powerful and massive. And so there's something displeasurable in that because it's threatening, but yet something oddly pleasurable because it kind of directs our attention back onto ourselves, onto our essentially rational nature. And he says at the beginning of this account, we call sublime that which is absolutely great. And he says this is a nominal definition of the sublime, nomen erklärung. It's not really a definition in the strict sense, but kind of an explication of the term from facts about usage. Like when we use the word sublime, basically, we're thinking of something that's absolutely great. So there's two things to say about that is, well, first of all, nothing in nature is absolutely great, like by Kant's light, certainly, right? Nature is a phenomenal order. It's essentially an order of relations. And so there's just, nothing can be absolutely great. Everything's always, if it's this biggest thing you can grasp, or if it's the most powerful force you can grasp, like the Tsar Bomba, it's still something you can measure in terms of there's some unit of measure that it can be iterated. That's as powerful as the power of so many horses, right? Everything, even the size of the Milky Way, is as big as so many solar systems or whatever. So everything in nature is an phenomenal order of relations. Therefore, nothing in nature can be absolutely great. Therefore, nothing in nature really is sublime, even though this is ostensibly an account of the sublimity of nature. So, he takes the true sublimity to lie in our own minds, in something about our essentially rational nature, which he conceives of as being in a different order of being than the material order, domain of nature in that sense. So, but who is the we that calls sublime what's absolutely great is also a really important question to ask, because it turns out the answer to that question does not lie in that Anglophone tradition that many readers of this stuff go back to when they try to understand Kant on the sublime. And yes, it's important. The Anglophone tradition is an important background to Kant's understanding of the sublime. But a lot of it for Kant is coming out of the rationalist tradition. And not just the German rationalist tradition that are his immediate predecessors, but an earlier rationalist tradition in Stoicism, and that comes into this German rationalist tradition through writers like Seneca, the Roman Stoic Seneca. So when he then says, we call sublime what is absolutely great, in many ways he's thinking of someone like Seneca, who says in De Ira, only virtue is sublime and exalted. That's at the end of book 1 of De Ira, his essay on anger. So basically what Kant's doing with that, and so why is virtue the only sublime thing for the Stoics? Well, virtue is the perfection of our essentially rational nature. Virtue is the right reason. It's right reason. It's perfect rationality that's attained through the effort of moral development. And so it's a very rare thing. They thought the sage was as rare as the Egyptian phoenix. So there aren't a lot of sages running around. There aren't a lot of truly virtuous people running around. We don't. There may never have been a sage, right? But this is a kind of ideal. And why is that sublime exactly? What does it mean to say that's elevated? Well, the way the Stoics think of that is basically we're all endowed with a rational capacity as human beings, and we are called. We're endowed with a rational capacity that we are called upon to make perfect, to bring to its full realization. That's all we mean by perfect. To bring to its full developmental realization, that's virtue. And so when we do that, there's a sense in which, the sage, and the passages in Seneca that say this directly, the sage is elevated above all the rest of, all other animals and all other human beings. And it's almost kind of like a status idea, and it's connected with notions of dignity in the Roman tradition that are, again, about status, notions of status. Yeah. So that's the sense in which virtue is sublime. The virtuous person is elevated above both the rest of nature, really, in having attained this perfection. And for Kant, he takes up this idea. Let me just add another thought about the Stoic version of this idea. When we basically don't exercise our rational endowment as we should, we misuse it in certain ways. We misvalue. We take to be good what's not in fact good, and all sorts of things like this. Then we degrade ourselves. Thought like this was actually very sharp in the Roman Stoic Epictetus, who wrote in Greek, Roman era Stoic. And so, because he would say things like, well, when we do this, we make ourselves into wild beasts, or sheep, or donkeys, or even into things like, inanimate objects like jugs, or stones. So, there's this idea that you can kind of carry on in such a way as you bring yourself down, you degrade yourself, you don't live up to your essentially rational nature, and then you're just not any better than you're not any better than a stone or a jug, or a sheep. But if you develop as you should, theoretically, you become a sage, and then there's some sense that that's an elevated state of being. So that's why virtue is sublime and exalted. And Kant takes up this idea. Kant also thinks that virtue is an ideal. So, and this is kind of a thing that you see very much in the Roman Stoic tradition, that virtue is they all recognize it's very rare, but the Roman Stoics kind of talk about somebody who's a progressor, somebody who's genuinely progressing towards virtue. And I think that that's really how Kant thinks of virtue as well, that really when we talk about human virtues, we're talking about progress, somebody who's progressing towards an ideal. And that too is actually probably quite rare. At any rate, when Kant talks about the sublime, this elevated state of mind that can be occasioned by what's massive or threatening, sort of mighty in nature, it throws our attention back onto that in us, which is capable of valuing in the way that one must value in order to progress towards nature, towards virtue, in order to value in such a way that one's actually developing one's essentially rational nature towards this end developmental telos, which is virtue. And so if you can value in this way, basically, it's in many ways ultimately understood in terms of doing what morality commands of you, simply because morality, you recognize that it's morally commanded, morally required, right? Acting from duty. It's all understood ultimately in some version of that thought. Anyway, that is kind of what is sublime, is kind of getting in touch with that part of your mentality. And so that's his version of the idea that only virtue is sublime. It's really, what's truly sublime is what he calls our moral predisposition, that in us which is able to sort of say, like, even if my life were at stake, I still wouldn't do this thing because it would be wrong. That, like your ability to kind of have that thought and be moved by it. That's what's going to be arousing this elevated state of mind that he calls, what he takes to be truly virtuous. So I think that gives you some kind of map of how to think about the Kantian conception of the sublime, and I hope it's helpful. For further reading, perhaps the first place to check is the Analytic of the Sublime, but it's scattered throughout all of his ethical writings, these ideas about the sublimity of morality, from the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals. There's a fair bit of it in the second critique, the Critique of Practical Judgment. And it's also crops up in important ways in part 1 of Religion Within the Bounds of Reason Alone. So I hope you found this helpful. And thanks.